Good evening, everybody. My name is Rich Boyd. I am the Assistant Division Chief of the Transportation and Toxics Division here at CARB.
Buenas noches, soy Rich Boyd, director de CARB.
I'd like to welcome you all to day 2 of our Freight Days listening session.
Estamos invitando a todos para el segundo día de estas conferencias.
Before we get started, we have a couple of Zoom housekeeping items that we'd like to go over just to maximize participation.
Antes de comenzar, tenemos varios punticos que queremos no clarificar, pero hablar antes de comenzar la conferencia con respecto al cómo activarse con Zoom.
And so I'm going to turn it over now to Amanda Anderson. Amanda?
Voy a pasarle un momentico a Amanda Anderson.
Thanks, Rich. So to start off, we just want to let everyone know that we are recording this session and it will be made available on CARB's YouTube channel.
Nada más que queremos hacerle notificar que vamos a grabar la sección y va a estar disponible en el canal de CARB.
So we have 2 options for accessing Spanish language interpretation today.
Tenemos 2 opciones para accesar la interpretación de español hoy.
So the first option is within Zoom. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a globe icon labeled interpretation.
La primera es dentro del contexto de Zoom, van a ver que en la línea de abajo hay un globo que dice interpretación.
You'll select Spanish, and then if you'd like to mute the original audio, that option is under the interpretation menu as well.
Va a seleccionar español y si necesita bloquear otro aspecto, ahí también está la posibilidad de hacerlo.
If you're using the cell phone app, interpretation is under the 3 dots or the more menu.
Si están utilizando el sistema del teléfono, el servicio de interpretación es donde están los puntos y ahí pueden ver el menú para accesar la interpretación en español.
And unfortunately, if you are calling into the conference today, you won't be able to access the Zoom interpretation.
Si usted está llamando de modo conferencia, desafortunadamente no va a poder accesar la interpretación en español.
So if you'd like to call into our Spanish conference line, the information is on the screen. The phone number is 866-803-2146, and the passcode is 108-3550.
Si quiere realmente accesar a nuestra conferencia en español, puede hacerlo a través de la línea de conferencias. El número de llamada, el número para llamar es el 866-803-2146. Repito, 866-803-2146 y la contraseña es 1083550. Repito, 1083550.
And again, that conference line is only in Spanish.
Y de nuevo, la línea de conferencia es solamente en español.
Are there any questions about how to access interpretation?
¿Hay alguna pregunta de cómo accesar el sistema de interpretación?
Okay, so we'll go ahead and end sequential translation now and just give Maria a moment to move over to the Spanish channel.
Entonces, vamos a parar la parte de la traducción simultánea y me van a dar la oportunidad que yo me traslade al el cuarto de interpretación en español.
Thanks, Maria. Okay, so we do have everyone set to be muted when you come in, but if for whatever reason your microphone becomes unmuted while you're not speaking, we just ask that you please pay attention to that and stay muted to avoid disruption. And if you're representing an organization, we'd ask that you add the organization's name to the end of your name on Zoom here. So the way to do that is in the top right corner of your screen. You'll see 3 dots. When you click on that, you should have the option to rename yourself. We also ask that CARB staff please add CARB to the end of your name as well. And then the mute and unmute button should be either in the bottom left or the top right hand of your screen. and it looks like a microphone. If you're calling in, you'll be able to press *6 in order to mute or unmute yourself. And then we also have the ability to use our cameras today. That icon is right next to the mute button. Again, that's either going to be in the bottom left or the top right of your screen. And we just encourage you to use your camera if you're comfortable, especially when you're talking. And then if you'd like to comment, we'll be utilizing raise hand today. So there's 2 ways to access that, depending on the version of Zoom that you have. One is if you open up the participation list or the participant list, you'll have the option to raise your hand at the bottom of that. Or you look in your reactions menu and you'll have the raise hand feature there. If you're calling in over the phone, you'll dial *9. However, occasionally this feature doesn't work for those who are calling in. So Gabby will be checking in periodically to see if there's any comments from the phone line. When she does that, feel free to unmute yourself and give your comment at that point. And then again, if you're using the app, that's going to be located under the More menu. We're also going to be utilizing the chat today. So you can chat to everybody that's in the meeting, or you can send private chats to any of the hosts. If you don't see that chat icon, it's at the bottom of your screen and it looks like a message bubble. Please feel free to ask questions or to provide comments within the chat, and we'll do our best to either respond to those in the chat or respond to them verbally. Also, if you'd like to receive any follow-up from this meeting and links to the recordings, as well as a certificate acknowledging your participation, you can send me a private chat with your contact information, your email address, and your name. And in order to do that, when you look at the chat menu, there should be a drop down and you should see me at the top. It'll be *host Amanda Anderson. And then the last thing that I want to mention is that we have Poll Everywhere that we'll be using today. So we'll be using this to get your feedback. And in order to respond, you'll either go to the webpage, pollev.com/home, and enter the username CARB306 and select join. Or you can text CARB306 to 22333. And I believe that Crystal just put that same information into the chat. So we'll go ahead and test this just to make sure that everybody has access to it. Then we'll start with one polling question here. And you'll see the instructions for how to access Poll Everywhere there at the top. And again, Crystal put the instructions in the chat as well. So if you want to test that, make sure that it's working for you. Awesome. Great, seeing some responses coming in. It looks like it's working. And then you'll just leave that web page open throughout the day today, and we'll be doing a couple poll questions after each of the presentations. And then at the end, a brief evaluation using Poll Everywhere as well. If for whatever reason you're not seeing questions pop up in the web page, just try to refresh the page first. And if you're still having issues, you can reach out to me or Crystal through the chat. Is anybody having issues accessing the Poll Everywhere? Okay, so I'll go ahead and close this and I'll turn it back over to Rich. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Amanda. Again, I'd like to welcome you to day 2 of our Freight Days listening session. Topic presentations and discussions from day 1, which we held on Tuesday, centered around seaports, rail yards, and border crossings. Day 1, we were fortunate to have our Deputy Executive Officer for Environmental Justice, Chanel Fletcher, who gave us a keynote address. which focuses on environmental racism, where some people get better treatment than others, and underscored the importance of racial equity, which is realized when race can no longer be used to predict life outcomes. For those who were not able to attend day one, as Amanda indicated earlier, that session was recorded along with today's session, and so that can be accessed on our YouTube page over the next week or so. Today's session will feature topic discussions on warehouses, airports, and an overview of CARB's freight projects and regulatory processes. So without further ado, I want to launch right into the warehouse discussion. Before we get started, I do want to indicate that during each of our topic sessions, we do have note takers capturing notes, capturing your comments and suggestions. These notes will be made publicly with the materials after the listening session. The note takers may interject during the discussion just to make sure that they're capturing your comments correctly and accurately. So please be aware of that. So with that, I'd like to turn over the floor to Andre Freeman, who will walk us through our warehouse discussion. Andre?
Great, thank you, Rich. So good evening, everyone. My name is Andre Freeman, and I'm the manager of the freight policy section here at CARB. We're now going to go through a discussion on freight activities that occur at warehouses and distribution centers throughout California. Next slide. So I think we're all pretty familiar with warehouses, and we're seeing them pop up everywhere near populated areas. Warehouses regularly have many types of vehicles and equipment that operate at them, including forklifts, trucks that operate in the yard and traveling to and from the facilities, refrigeration units that keep perishable goods chilled, and other types of specialized equipment depending on the facility type. Next slide. Warehouses are an essential part of California's freight system and represents a significant portion of the state's economy, but also represents nearly half of the air pollution in the state. This air pollution impacts the health and well-being of all Californians, but poses a significantly increased risk to a large number of communities that are disproportionately impacted by freight, primarily due to their close proximity to freight facilities. Next slide. So particulate matter, also known as PM, is a type of emission that comes in different types and sizes and has many different sources. Diesel-powered freight equipment is a common source of PM that we talk about when we talk about freight emissions. So why is PM so concerning? Well, PM can lead to many negative health impacts, including premature death, heart and lung issues, and some of the other ailments listed here. We also need to highlight the fact that these health issues have a secondary negative economic impact on people, as they often lead to increased trips to the hospital, lost work and school days, and many other real-world impacts that are often overlooked. Next slide, please. So what is CARB doing to address these issues? Well, we have many different regulatory actions that are geared towards minimizing the health impacts of freight, which are either already approved or currently under development. This slide covers the suite of freight regulations that we have coming up, with the top half in yellow representing zero emission technologies that are going to be regulated, and then the bottom half focusing on combustion technologies that are going to be improved. Specific to warehouses, the transportation refrigeration unit, forklift, advanced clean fleets, and other truck regulations will have a significant impact on cleaning up these warehouses facilities, and those are the ones that we'll focus on tonight. Next slide. So as we get into the discussion here, we wanted to remind folks that there's a lot of information available on our website and also the South Coast Air District's websites about the activities we have going on to address these warehouse impacts. And then if you have any questions, any issues navigating the websites, or just don't know where to go, feel free to just email us at freight@arb.ca.gov, and we'll help you find the right people or information that you're looking for. So with that, Rich and Amanda, turn back over to you.
All right, thanks, Andre. So before we get into our questions and comments, we do have a poll question for you. And so Amanda, go ahead and fire up the So this poll question is, what are your specific concerns or interest in warehouses? And so this is where you get to type in your responses. So are you concerned about the trucks, or, okay, here comes one, way too many warehouses. The indoor air quality for workers. There are other traffic concerns around warehouses, idling trucks. I think somebody concerned about idling trucks. Workers' compensation. Truck routes, and by that I assume that the concern there is the routes that the trucks take to get to the warehouses and perhaps the communities they're driving through. If that needs to be clarified, please drop something in the chat. Located adjacent to schools, traffic concerns, exploitative labor practices. Stopping air pollution from trucks taking over the community. Disregard for the community. It would be helpful to us if you could drop something in the chat, gives a little more specifics about some of the activities that are seen in disregard. Increasing number of warehouses in the valley affecting already disadvantaged communities. Cumulative air impacts in the most polluted areas. So these are all great observations. Okay, let's go ahead and, and that looks like we've reached a critical mass there. All right, so at this point, I'd like to open the floor for discussion. Just so folks know, we aren't putting commenters on a clock. However, we are asking that you be mindful of others who may wish to make a comment. And if you already made a comment and you're looking to make a second comment, please also be mindful of others who have yet to make a comment. We may call on those folks first. Also, just like to remind folks, if you have any issues with Zoom or raising your hand, you can also send your comments via text, by texting 22333 to a CARB EJ OCAP 306. We did have some folks on Tuesday that had some challenges with that. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to Gabby, who's going to help moderate this session. Gabby?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Gabby Enriquez. I'll be helping with the Q&A after each section. If you have any comments or questions, please raise your hand and I'll send you a request to unmute yourself. So you can make that comment. I'll also alternate between raised hands and comments or questions from the chat. And I'll be checking with the Spanish, with the conference lines to make sure we don't miss any comments or questions. We do have a comment from Rafael Yanes in the chat, everyone, if you want to address that. If you want me to read it, I can read it too.
So I can cover that, Gabby. So Rafael points out a very important fact. For those not familiar with what's going on down at the ports of LA and Long Beach, at the beginning of the pandemic, we were a little unsure of what was going to happen with the freight sector. We definitely saw a slowdown immediately as everybody was trying to figure out what to do, safety precautions and all those type of things. But very quickly into the pandemic, there was a significant surge in freight shipments, which has caused a backlog of ships at both those ports. Subsequently, all the product that those ships are bringing in are being transported on trucks and rail through all the communities down in Southern California. So those are definitely, some well-known facts at this point that are really driving CARB's push to pass all these truck regulations Again, both the ones to ensure that the existing fleet of diesel trucks are meeting the existing standards and are in good state of repair and not over polluting, and then really emphasizing our push to get zero emission trucks, especially in the drayage sector, out there as soon as possible.
Thank you, Andre. We do have a raised hand from Steven Jimenez. I'll go ahead and ask you to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Stephen Jimenez here with the American Lung Association. Firstly, just want to say thank you for allowing me to comment on today's presentation and for your efforts in cleaning up harmful air pollutants from the growing warehouse sector. Really just feel like these conversations are vital for community input and, understanding some regional needs that are going on. So really just thank you for that. According to our Lung Association recent State of the Air reports, 98% of Californians live in counties impacted by unhealthy air. But we know that within the freight impacted communities, these burdens are really extreme. And ultimately, this really disproportionately impacts our most vulnerable communities. That includes children, seniors, people living with respiratory and cardiovascular challenges, low-income communities, and communities of color. And, with that, I'd just like to ask, recently the Gulf Coast AQMD passed a warehouse indirect source rule, I believe it was PR 2305. Is CARB engaging on this or working with other air districts to elevate this rule as clean energy strategy? So they have a clean air strategy?
Yeah, so thanks for that comment. So that's a really important thing to call out, and that's why we added it to that website list that we just showed on the slides. For those that aren't familiar with it, the South Coast Air Quality Management District just did finish up a process that their staff took a couple of years to do. Congratulations to them, because I know it was a very trying process. But it was an effort to utilize a tool that the air districts have in their tool belt to pass what is called an indirect source rule, which looks at a certain type of facility and works with those facility owners and all the industry stakeholders and community members who are involved with those facilities to really figure out how to reduce the emissions from those type of facilities overall. So the air districts do have the ability to do this. And, South Coast exercised that ability with their recent warehouse ISR. If you're looking to places like the Bay Area or the San Joaquin Valley, it's really up to each air district whether or not they try to use that tool or if they're relying on CARB regulatory activities to resolve some of those issues. So yes, Stephen, we definitely do work very closely with the air districts, whether they're planning to use the ISR as a tool or if we're strategizing with them to use other tools that both of our entities have at our disposal to kind of address those issues. But I think the fact that there are issues pretty much everywhere in California is not lost on both CARB and air districts as we try to tackle these issues.
Thanks, Andre. We have another comment from Jonathan Pritt in the chat.
Yeah, so Jonathan pointed out that especially in the Manteca, Lathrop, and Stockton area, there's an increased amount of warehouses being built, and those definitely have impacts on the surrounding community. So Jonathan, we'll get back to this comment. It'll be covered in the CEQA portion of our presentation, where we're going to talk about the actions that CARB takes even before these facilities are built to try to help mitigate some of those impacts and ensure that local land use decisions are being made intelligently and are thinking about the community and not just economic growth for the region. So stay tuned, we'll be covering that a little bit more soon.
All right, I don't see any other hands, so I'll pause here and ask if we have any questions or comments from the conference line. All right. We have another hand from Marvin Norman. I sent you a request. Go ahead and unmute yourself, please.
Hi, yes. One thing that we've noticed here in the Inland Empire is that we have a lot of situations where, the AQMD puts in comments and talks about the air impacts The community puts in comments on projects to talk about the air impacts. Sometimes I think maybe even the AG is sent in comments about the air impacts, and the agencies are still just like, well, we don't care. We're just approving everything anyway, no matter how much it's going to pollute. Essentially, no matter what the significant impacts are, they just simply just do not care and do not bother. I mean, they don't even follow their own guidelines in many cases on mitigating the impacts from the air pollution side and GHG. And so that's just a real problem. Just agencies just completely refusing to do the bare minimum of their duty to regulate.
Yeah, so Marvin, are you talking about kind of the local city and county decisions to approve permits for new facilities being built?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, I'm looking at one right now for a project in Moval, and you know, it's all the air quality portions are way over, and the city's essentially, I highly doubt the city's going to turn it down.
Yeah, so that's definitely an issue we're well aware of, and that kind of goes into that bucket of stay tuned, because we're going to talk about what CARB's doing on our side to try to help mitigate those issues through the CEQA process. But yeah, we definitely continue to see similar things on our side. You know, we work with these local entities. We provide them recommendations. We send in formal letters, much like everybody else does. You know, we assist with the Attorney General's office when they get involved with certain project types. So there are a lot of efforts going on. And I think we all know that aside from these efforts, there are some, you know, legal issues going on, because when it gets to that point where, you know, your voice hasn't been heard, sometimes a lawsuit's the only remedy. And then there are also activities going on the legislative front, where some of the state legislators are looking at doing things to really put some of those best practices for the siting and development of new facilities into law. So, you know, outside of those laws being put into place, CARB is taking actions, but we'll cover that in the next presentation a little bit more. But thank you for your comment.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and read a follow-up comment from Raphael. He says, I would recommend CARB increase proportionately your heavy-duty vehicle inspection program. Recent deployments of them in and around the Vernon and Boyle Heights area have been very successful. An increase of 100% of the HD VIP is needed. Thank you for your comment, Raphael. And then we have another question in the chat from Yasi from the Sierra Club, or Sierra Club.
Okay, so this question is regarding how is the Advanced Clean Fleet regulation going to address last mile deliveries? And for those not familiar with the term, last mile deliveries are usually the things that you see where you see an Amazon delivery truck, a UPS or FedEx truck driving through your neighborhood to deliver a package to basically a person, end user, company, what have you. So Craig, did you want to respond to that one?
Absolutely. Thanks, Andre. So yeah, the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation is looking at requiring companies that do last mile deliveries to phase in zero emission trucks over time. And we're looking at those private companies that own those delivery trucks. We're looking at the drayage trucks, obviously. We're also looking at the public side. So public fleets that also own trucks and operate in neighborhoods. The regulation is focused on getting those dirty diesels off the road, replacing them with zero emission trucks.
And I would just add, I think the end of your question about, will this regulation provide a pathway for zero emission operation for last mile? I think we'd say definitely. There are definitely some truck types, especially longer haul options, which have, the technology does have limitations. But for things like last mile delivery and drayage, as Craig just mentioned, we definitely see that there's a near-term opportunity for zero emission truck deployment. So as we start releasing the details about our proposal for the Advanced Clean Truck or Advanced Clean Fleet regulation, you'll start to see the specific numbers. And one of the things that we're going to do in our future workshops and outreach events for that regulation is be a lot more clear on the types of trucks that we're covering. I think there's been some confusion about whether certain truck types are or aren't included under the regulation. So we're going to make sure in our future public meetings to be very clear about what type of trucks are being covered and how quickly we expect those trucks to be turned over to zero emission.
Great. I don't see any other comments or raised hands. Is anybody in the conference line have any questions?
I think before we move on, I think there's a question I'd like to put out there. Just as we think about warehouses and some of the emission sources, that are there. There's a couple that come to mind, as Andre had mentioned during this presentation. One being transport refrigeration units, another being drayage trucks, which we talked about just a little bit, and and forklifts. And so, does anyone out there have any questions or comments or concerns about? For example, transportation refrigeration units or TRUs or forklifts. And I think somebody just dropped something into the chat.
Yeah, they can raise their hand, but they want to make a comment. Shada, I'll send you a request to unmute yourself and see if that works. You can go ahead and make your comment.
Hi, yes, it did. Thank you so much. I'm Shada, and I'm with the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability based in Fresno. I have a comment and then also a question. I think some people here are knowledgeable of the heavy-duty truck rulemakings that CARB is undertaking. So my question for the team here is about CARB's role in addressing the unfair siting of warehouses in low-income communities of color, and especially in inland California. Community members that we work with tell us how generations of families have been impacted in their neighborhood. Older folks are dying of cancer, babies are developing asthma. Community members have little to no tolerance and shouldn't need to be tolerant of any continued use of polluting fuels in their communities, and especially when they would still be experiencing a scale of thousands of trucks going by their homes every day. So I think this underscores why we need fully electric trucks as soon as possible. I need to uplift the research that's been done on the feasibility of electric trucks. But at the same time, this level of freight traffic going through communities every day is why electrification is also not enough. We need to be digging deep into the root issue of why warehouses are in low-income communities of color in the first place. And I would love to hear from any CARB staff tonight if CARB has plans to address this interconnection between land use and freight in any of the upcoming regional or sectoral development plans, such as the Just Transition Roadmap or even the Scoping Plan, for example.
Thanks for that comment, Shada. I think that ties to a few other comments that we've heard where, it doesn't matter where you are in California, there's new facilities going up, and most of them are going up nearby existing clusters of facilities. So when we're talking about that cumulative air impact issue, I mean, it just keeps getting worse and worse. So the CARB regulation that you should focus most on as far as electrifying those trucks is that Advanced Clean Fleet regulation that we just spoke about. That's going to be our next big truck requirement that's going to require fleets themselves to adopt those vehicles in the near term. As far as your question about how does CARB weigh into land use decisions? So again, a lot of the land use decision making authority, the permitting and approval of new facilities and those type of things is delegated down to the local government level. Recognizing this, CARB has taken actions in the past. We have developed a concept paper for a freight handbook. I think that was 2 years ago, that had a large list of best practices that these local entities can put into place. It's really a list of considerations to say, should you be siting that facility and that location that's right in that disadvantaged community, right behind that elementary school or hospital or what have you? Some local governments are definitely taking that into account when they vote. Some of them, I mean, if we're being honest, that economic growth consideration, ends up being the reason why they vote certain ways. So CARB does what it can to kind of weigh in on those decisions, and again, works with the governments themselves. We work with community stakeholders who need help quantifying the problems so that when they do things like go and testify or write letters, that we can assist folks with some of our expertise if necessary. And then in addition to that, again, the next portion of our presentation will cover how CARB participates in the CEQA process. And they'll talk a little bit about what CEQA is and how that can help impact some of these new freight projects that are coming up. So again, thank you for reiterating this issue. Definitely a problem that we agree with. CARB has some authority to weigh in on these things, but we definitely need to do a better job of getting local governments to do their part to take care of that land use issue.
Thanks, Andre. I want to read a comment from Rafael Yanes regarding enforcement. We do have Aaron from enforcement here. Enforcement of existing rules now will get the communities immediate relief while establishing new rules or filling in any loopholes currently being exploited.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, Rafael. We completely agree with you. Enforcement is very important, and we do make every effort to enforce the current regulations out there. And you also earlier mentioned the enforcement in Vernon and Boyle Heights, and we are actively out there and stepping up enforcement in that area as well. So I really appreciate your comment. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think, Rafael, one of your other comments higher up, you pointed out certain things that were working and that we might want to put more resources into. So I know folks are quite often focused on some of the continuing problems that we have or areas where things need to be stepped up. But please also help us identify where things are working and we should do more of it, because that definitely helps us determine where we can best use our resources.
All right, we have another raised hand from Andrea. I'm gonna go ahead and request you to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi everybody. Andrea out of the Inland Empire. So when the indirect source rule, we're working, to get an indirect source rule, we did some studies on like the locations of warehouses that were going to be affected by the rule. And we tried to draw some conclusions on like what kind of positive impacts it would have. I mean, one of the most striking ones was that like over 80% of the warehouses that were going to be affected by the rule, I think it's like over 3,000 warehouses, sit in a community where it sit in a zip code where the majority of the people there are people of color. That's over 80%. And so like when we're talking about environmental justice, warehousing, it's so clear that this is a place where we need to do the most work on. And, I understand that CARB has been doing partnerships with like the CEC to figure out how we're gonna, get the grid ready for like all of the electric trucks that we need in our communities. But I'm also, to Shada's point, I'm also wondering though, like that, how are we also planning, or how is CARB working with any planning, like statewide planning agencies, to figure out how to more sustainably set up our goods movement system? Because right now, like Marvin said, they're coming up left and right. And so, there, it doesn't seem like, and it's one for one, right? It's whoever wants to put it, puts it there, and no really regard if it's efficient, if it's going to help with traffic, if it's going to help an overall system, because it's not just one warehouse, it's all of these together. And so, where can CARB push more on that? And then the other thing I guess I'll bring up as a concern is that with our indirect source rule, right, gas trucks were included as a way to meet the compliance. And although we are very opposed to that, because of the fact that it's also an environmental justice burden to the people that are affected by the distribution and production of gas, wondering how, we're going to be able to advance the advanced clean fleet rule as much as possible so we can minimize the amount, the usage of gas trucks and really start pushing as many electric trucks forward. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. I'll answer the advanced clean fleet question right now. So definitely, as we continue to work with folks like yourself to figure out the specific requirements for that regulation and really how hard we're going to be able to push zero emission trucks into certain truck categories, we are focused on zero emission trucks, not really an interim step at this point. So again, as you see, as we come out with additional public workshops and community outreach events in the coming months, we're definitely going to really focus on that discussion you just mentioned of, we're talking about how this is a transition from the diesel fleet to zero emission, but I mean, we're talking about the end goal of full zero emission, not, let's stop and take an interim step. So hopefully the end result is exactly what you and other community members are looking for to eliminate that issue. You also had a lot of other questions and comments, I think, that resonate with some of the ones we heard earlier about land use decisions, how we're working with planning entities and other things. If you don't mind, I'd like to come back to those questions after we have our CEQA presentation, because I do think that presentation will cover part of the answer. And then we can also talk about how we work with local governments, the Governor's Office of Planning and Research, and also some of the transportation agencies to tackle those planning decisions. So we will get back to that comment or that question in just a few minutes here.
All right, I'm gonna read another question from the chat from Eddie Phillips. He says, most trucks use public fueling stations. If charging infrastructure lags behind the ACF, what are the unintended consequences of those stranded assets?
Yeah, thanks, Eddie. That's a really important thing that we need to consider when we develop our regulations, not just for truck drivers who are asking to purchase these new vehicles, and they may not own their own infrastructure. They may need something like a gas station model where somebody else operates it and they just go there and charge or get hydrogen fueling. And so we are working closely with some of the state's energy agencies and all of the state's electric utilities to really determine what a reasonable timeline is for the development of the infrastructure that's needed to support these vehicles. And obviously, over the coming decade, we're all going to be watching very closely to see how those things roll out. So we have the plans that we're establishing today. Those plans will continue to be updated over time as we see technology advance. I'm sure we're going to run into some issues. Some of the initial issues that we've had are simplistic things like local governments being slow on permitting of things like EV chargers. So in collaboration with the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, we're really working to proactively identify some of those issues that might come up, start working on them now, even before the infrastructure is developed, to eliminate some of those possible barriers. But we'll definitely keep an eye on, what challenges we might have in the future, and our regulations are set in that where they can accommodate, from a timeline standpoint, can accommodate if any of those infrastructure issues come up. We can make changes to make sure that the stranded asset issue is limited. But thank you for that, because infrastructure is definitely a big part of the conversation that's quite often forgotten.
All right, I'll read another couple comments since we don't have any raised hands. We have a quick comment from Roberta Feliciano. She says, yes to higher standards for truck emissions, please, electric and beyond. Thank you, Roberta, for your comment. And then we have another comment/question from Grecia. Thanks for those comments and generally appreciate the work you all put into it. Unfortunately, last I understood, the freight concept paper was still in the draft form. Does CARB have plans to finalize and promote the concept paper? And related, the Attorney General's office released a warehouse guidance document of sorts as well. Are there any plans/efforts for a collaborative effort to join both documents?
That's a great question. So yes, we did post a concept paper, which has a large number of great ideas in it. We did work with the Attorney General's office a little bit in their development of their guidance document. There are also some local governments, such as the County of Riverside, who also has their own similar documents out there. And right now what we're doing is we're taking, all the takeaways, great lessons learned, best practices and recommendations from those various documents and all the research that went into them, and really figuring out ways to implement them in communities. So an example of how CARB's implementing this, the information and input that we got during the development of our concept paper, we're feeding that into our Office of Community Air Protection activities. So that covers the AB 617 community activities and our other community outreach to really, weigh into those local government processes, work with air districts to figure out how we can implement some of those steps, and really focus on not just, releasing another document that local governments or other folks will put on a shelf and forget about, but, taking firsthand steps to say, we have this document out there, the Attorney General's office has a document out there, Riverside has a document out there, it's been documented enough. Let's talk about how we can really implement and get people to take those steps seriously. Everything from how they do their community outreach to how they make their land use decisions to educating local governments on the best way to figure out what the actual health impacts of these facilities are. So we're really down at the ground level at this point, figuring out how we can get the takeaways from all of those documents actually implemented in practice.
All right. I'll pause one more time to see if we have any questions from the conference line. All right, and I don't see any other raised hands. We do have a comment from Raphael. If somebody wants to answer that in the chat as we move on to the next section.
Thanks, Gabby. Before we move on to the next section, I'd like to ask Lashe to go ahead and share her screen. She was capturing some notes for us. And I want to ask everybody to take a quick look at those notes just to make sure that we captured things accurately, or if there needed to be some clarifications or some additions. And if there do need to be clarifications or additional questions, go ahead and drop those in the chat, and then make sure Amanda has your contact info. And so there's the notes right there. And again, the intent here, these were captured at a higher level, so we weren't capturing everything, word for word. But I'll pause just a second and give folks a minute to take a look at that. So some of the comments we had there: increased movement of TEUs at ports this year leads to higher emissions in EJ communities. We also had a number of questions and comments related to our SECRA process, which we'll get to after the next topic. See a comment down there: what are the unintended consequences of infrastructure lagging behind ACF? And then I see Raphael's hand. I don't know if that was from before. Is that new?
I believe that's new. I'll go ahead and unmute you, Raphael.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for this second meeting, and I appreciate all the efforts that you guys are putting in to listen out for the community comments and whatnot. Some of the comments that I know our community in the East LA, Boyle Heights, and West Commerce areas has commented, as well as the various other communities in and around the Inland Empire that I've heard. I went ahead and wrote that specific comment in the chat. It would be helpful for CARB to address many of the major ingress and egress points as these huge communities are developed with major warehouse distribution centers. I mean, in the millions of square feet per building. It would be helpful if there could be some installation of monitoring equipment right at these major freeway ingress and egress points that many of these trucks will take, especially, looking at the Inland Empire, looking at Bloomington, for instance, with the huge planned communities that they're going to be instituting eminent domain in order to take over a good portion of that area. And so the monitoring equipment could easily capture a lot of this necessary data as a tool that CARB can use to monitor the effectiveness of not only the ISR rule, but also any hotspots that you guys might have, because many of these warehouses are going in adjacent to the EJ communities. And so the monitoring equipment could measure all these primary toxins, if you will, that are currently measured. And then we now have a tool not only to write legislation, but also to seek out enforcement action, legislative funding, look over time how effective the ISR rule is in the transition from diesel over to electric. There's many benefits from it. And then the funding sources from this could come from the fees that are collected for the ISR rules. And then again, hard data is great for the community because we could actually point to and see, hey, look, there's the monitoring equipment, and this is what they're picking up. This is what's coming into our community, and they can actually see the increases over time and actually do something about it. Now we have concrete evidence. And so that's something that's easily done. Caltrans, the state of California owns the land in and around these areas. Caltrans already has the infrastructure, electric, the land. Most of these things are miniaturized now that they can placed on a tower, or they could be placed on a support that is already existing. So these are really low-hanging fruit items that can be easily employed, and valuable tools that could feed, a wealth of data and knowledge. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Raphael. And again, we'll have the opportunity to further discuss some of the secret-related issues in the upcoming topic. But before we get to that, I'd like to shift focus to the next topic, which is airports. And so I want to turn the floor over to Nick, who's going to walk us through that presentation.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Nick Storelli, and I work here at CARB within the Freight Activity Branch. I would like to introduce Angela Chondesh, Matt Diner, Angie Polanco, and Anthony Poggi, who are also on the panel with me here tonight. So the goal of this presentation is to provide a high-level overview of the airports in California and to talk about the associated emission sources that impact air quality and public health. We'll look at the current state of airport and aircraft regulations in California, and we will provide insight on timing and authority for future emissions reductions for this sector. I'll also be briefly discussing the existing ways in which CARB staff interact with community members. Our main goal during this session is to hear from you about what your main areas of concern are regarding airport emission sources. I would just like to again thank everyone for joining us tonight, and I would like to highlight the importance of your participation. We value all of your opinions, and we would like to hear all of your suggestions and concerns regarding airports. So next slide, please. So the airport-related emissions are a significant contributor to California's air pollution. California is home to 2 of the nation's 10 busiest airports by passengers and 3 of the 11 busiest by cargo weight. According to Federal Aviation Administration data from 2019, California's commercial passenger trips represented 12.9% of all US commercial passengers. And airports throughout California handled 11.1% of all of the US cargo. The aviation sector is responsible for emitting nitrogen oxides, hydrocarbons, greenhouse gases, and particulate matter, among other pollutants. The main emission sources for airports are the aircraft jet engines, the auxiliary power units, and ground transportation. Aircraft jet engines are obviously the most known emission source. However, there are multiple other sources that also contribute to the total emissions from airports. Auxiliary power units, or APUs for short, contribute to the on-ground emissions at airports throughout the state. And APUs are small turbine engines on the commercial aircraft that provide electricity to the plane while it's parked at the gate. So besides the emissions from the main jet engines and APUs, there are many other small emission sources that come from airports that facilitate on-ground operations and the movement of people and goods. An example of these additional sources are ground support equipment, such as cargo loaders, ground power units, aircraft tugs, and airport shuttles. And all of these are contributors to the on-ground emission sources. Next slide, please. So now that we know the different emission sources from the airports, the next question is, what's CARB's role in getting emissions reductions from this source? So due to the nature of air travel, government bodies from the international, federal, state, and local level all have different authorities and roles to play to reduce emissions from the aviation sector. Here at CARB, we are currently evaluating federal, state, and local authority in setting emission standards for airports and aircraft. In addition to evaluating authority, CARB will be closely working with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the Federal Aviation Administration on setting more stringent aircraft engine and fuel emission standards. CARB will also be working with airports, airlines, stakeholders, and local air districts to evaluate and develop incentive programs in the hopes of bringing cleaner aircraft to California. And currently, there are regulations in place at the state level that target airport ground transportation. In 2019, CARB passed the Zero Emission Airport Shuttle Regulation to transition all of the airport shuttles to zero emission at the regulated airports. Go next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, our primary goal for this session tonight is to hear from you about what your concerns are and about how we can better engage with you on future airport-related air quality concerns within your communities. Presently, CARB staff engage with community members in a number of different ways, including through public workshops, community meetings, individual meetings between select CARB staff and community groups, or through the submittal of your comment letters or public testimonies at board hearings. And so we would like to hear from you about additional methods that you would like us to see us try to use in order to help improve your ability to engage with CARB staff in the future. Next slide, please. And then on this final slide, we have provided the main contacts for the different programs that pertain to airports. Please feel free to reach out to any of the staff on this page with any program-specific questions that you may have. And with that, that concludes my presentation. Back to you, Rich.
All right, thanks, Nick. Before we get to the comment section, we have a couple more poll questions. So Amanda, could you put the first one up for us, please?
Sorry about the delay there.
All right, so this one is, what airport-related emission sources are you most concerned about? So there's a couple of options there. And if an option that you're thinking about is not listed, there's a section to mark other. And if you select other, it'll help us out if you go ahead and describe in the chat what that is. So this far, it looks like aircraft engines are dominated with ground support equipment and other coming up there. So right now we don't have anything in the chat about what the other is. So it looks like we don't have interest amongst the participants for auxiliary power units or airport shuttles so far. Go ahead and give this one a few more seconds, but it does look like we have reached a point of stability. Okay, next poll question.
Rich, we do just have one for airports.
Oh, just one. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we had two there. Okay, so let's go ahead and close out that poll, and then we'll go ahead and open the floor up to comments. I do want to note in the chat there were a couple of comments that were related to CEQA, so we'll circle back on those in the next session. So those have not been forgotten. But Gabby.
Thanks, Rich. Okay, so we have a couple questions. Let me just get back to those in the chat. Raphael, I think this is related to the polling question. He chose other. EJ community concern is for airport traffic overhead for the planes on approach. Since FAA switched over from VLF to satellite for approach patterns, there has been a concentration of emissions over EJ communities. Thanks for your answer, Raphael. We have another question from Yassi. What are ways CARB and FAA are able to work on facing zero emission for air cargo, airport equipment, and electric options to plug in equipment or planes?
So in regards to electric aviation, we have been exploring that technology. CARB has been working with other stakeholders that currently are in the process of designing and testing electric aircraft. In the short haul commuter market, the technology is there and it's feasible to use battery technology for electric aviation. It's currently not there yet for the long haul market, but we are definitely interested in the growth and development of electric aviation in the hopes of greatly reducing emissions.
Thanks, Nick. I don't see any raised hands. Do we have any questions or comments from the conference line? All right. We have a question from Eddie Phillips. What are CARB's view of the use of renewable diesel for federal sources?
We have seen some interest from the industry to explore alternative fuels. And I think the concern here is the supply issue. But that's one of the areas of what we've heard through discussions with recent the air quality management plan updates with the South Coast Air Districts and USCP and FAA. There's a strong interest in it, but again, that's a long-term assessment, and fuel supply need to be a part of this.
Thanks, Angela. We do have a raised hand. Andrea, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Gabby. So I think folks already touched on it, but the flight paths are something that's of extreme concern. I mean, there was a project out here in San Bernardino when Amazon Air came in. Underneath the flight path, there was a school that was relocated. I believe houses were bought out. It's like, I think there are smaller airports right now that are getting impacted or will be impacted with freight because our traffic is so bad that I'm guessing freight might be more efficient to start moving things. And so I can imagine that smaller airports are gonna see the same effect. I think the volume of the change in volume of freight coming into this airport is going to be changing just dramatically. And so to the point about monitoring these changes, I think it's really important. I think something we don't have enough information about here. This is an ex-Air Force base. It was shut down for a really long time, so it was pretty dormant. And over the past couple of years, UPS, FedEx worked there. And then now Amazon created its new West Coast air freight system. And so we don't know, right? We don't know what exactly the impacts are going to be, both from airplanes flying over and then like the hundreds of trucks that now are going to come in every day. So I think that's really important. And I say that because I think in South Coast, there was a study in Santa Monica about the impacts of that small airport. And I think it eventually led to them creating a curfew. And so just, being able to supply us with the information and tools, I think is really important because those curfew is a way to mitigate impacts, right? For a 24-hour facility. So just, yes, definitely a gap in knowledge that I would say that we have out here.
Yeah, thank you very much for your feedback. It's very, very valuable.
Right, we have another question from Marco Price. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your last name. Question is hydrogen as a fuel under consideration for air traffic?
Yeah, I think, all types of fuels that are able to get emissions reductions are being considered. With aviation, a lot of the authority with fuel usage lies with the federal government, with the EPA and FAA. They take safety very seriously, and any type of change to the fuel used in aircraft has to be highly tested. But definitely, I think any type of fuel that that we can use to reduce emissions would be beneficial and is being studied.
Great, thanks, Nick. We do have John Shear share with us an article, a systematic review of the impact of commercial aircraft activity on air quality near airports. Thank you for that, John. Any other comments? I don't see any raised hands right now. For comments in the conference line.
So before we move on, let me just kind of throw out a prompt, and it's actually going to start by going to the panelists to see if we have some questions of folks in the community. And so, as Nick was outlining in his presentation, there's some authority issues that may limit our ability as an agency to act. And so, understanding that and listening to just kind of what's been commented on there, are there any questions we want to put to the community in terms of like what areas we should be focusing on, what avenues we should be exploring with EPA or the FAA? Do you have any thoughts along that line? I might spur some discussion on there. Or do folks out there in the community have any thoughts they want to share along those lines? What particular areas are do you think we should be pursuing with FAA, in terms of a priority? Okay, while we're thinking about that, I think there was a lingering question about warehouses from the other session, and so maybe we'll go ahead and. Oh wait, never mind. Gabby, I see a.
Yeah, Andrea is saying conducting accurate EAs. That's her comment. Oh, and we have raised.
So I assume EAs in this case, Andrea, just let us know. Environmental assessment, is that what you're?
She said yes.
Yes. Okay. Good.
Thank you, Andrea. And we do have a raised hand from Yasi. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. This is Yasi with the Sierra Club based in Southern California. I think with the rise of air cargo and the .com logistics empires like Amazon and even other realtors getting in that space and competing, more partnerships with how freight movement is going to be incorporating, with freight movement and airports can be, should be looked at. I'm not sure if there's an airplane icon in the beginning slide when you all talked about freight being a part of half of the air pollution in California. So I think we're seeing it as a huge trend in the Inland Empire, not only in San Bernardino, but Ontario Airport as well.
Okay, thanks, Yasi. Any other questions or comments on this particular topic? Okay, at this point, I want to ask Kaylin to go ahead and share her screen just to show the comments that we captured. So folks take a look at those, make sure we captured them accurately, or if we need to include some additional comments. And if we do, just go ahead and drop those in the chat and then make sure Amanda has your contact information. And is there a way that we can make the document just a wee bit bigger? Here we go. So again, as a reminder, all the comments here that we capture, all the notes will be shared publicly. Okay, seeing no additional comments there. All right, so let's move on to the last topic here, our freight regs and process. And so I want to go ahead and turn the floor over to Leah Yamashita.
Thanks, Rich. Hi, everyone. My name is Leah Yamashita, and I'm going to be giving an overview of the regulatory and CEQA review processes. I have three panelists here with me, Stanley Armstrong, who works on CEQA project review, Leila Gonzalez, who is the staff lead on the new locomotive regulation under development, and Matt Diner, who works on the core incentive program. So I will start with the regulatory process, then I'll touch on the CEQA review process, and then open it up for a few polling questions and discussion to hear from you all. Next slide, please. So this first slide summarizes the main objectives we take into account when developing regulatory strategies. There's community risk reduction, regional and state air quality standards, and our climate and carbon neutrality goals. And so reducing emissions in the freight sector is critical to meeting all of these objectives. Next slide. This shows the types of actions CARB has the regulatory authority to take and examples of past regulatory efforts to reduce emissions from the freight sector. Next slide. Here's our favorite slide that we always use. But it's important to show the different freight regulations CARB is developing and the timing of each one. So this year, the board will hear items on transport refrigeration units, trucks, and commercial hovercraft. Next slide. This slide gives an overview of the regulatory process. Boxes with an asterisk represent opportunities for the public to engage. So we start with our preliminary rulemaking activity that includes workshops, work group meetings, stakeholder calls, site visits, community meetings. Then we issue the board hearing notice and the 45-day comment period begins. Then we have our board hearing. Then if we make any significant changes to our proposal, we're required to put that out for an additional 15-day comment period. Then we have a second board hearing if necessary. Then the board makes the decision to approve or disapprove staff's proposal. Then once the board approves the regulation, we file it with the Office of Administrative Law. And then once the Office of Administrative Law approves it, the regulation becomes effective. So it's a long process, but again, there are several opportunities for stakeholder involvement. And then next slide. Public engagement that supports the development of our regulations is extremely important. We receive input from communities, agencies, and industry that informs our strategies. Sustainable freight is also a topic of discussion at our regular meetings with non-governmental entities that include environmental and health advocacy groups. We continue to work to strengthen our partnerships with communities by starting our engagement early and ensuring communication throughout the process, which allows us to better integrate different perspectives, including those from the community. Next slide. This slide touches on the CEQA review process. Staff reviews and comments on freight-related projects to advocate for the use of the cleanest commercially available equipment and technologies at various facilities. This can include cold storage warehouses, distribution facilities, seaports, and rail yards. The comments provide suggested mitigation measures to reduce project impacts on air quality and public health, particularly in disadvantaged communities. The comments also identify deficiencies that need to be addressed within the air quality analysis to ensure the public is properly informed of a project's impacts to public health. Next slide. And this last slide is just our contact information. You can email us anytime. You can visit our website or sign up for notifications of new activities and meeting notices. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Leah. Before we get to the comment section, we do have another poll question for you. So let's go ahead and put that up there. And this question is, what can we do to better facilitate your participation in the regulatory development process? This is a free-form one, so I'll make sure to allow adequate time for folks to respond. And so some things that could go here is, ways we interact, types of documentation you'd like to see, anything along those lines. Have workshops and mini groups. And so when you say mini groups, is there a specific thought in mind about how that mini group would be structured and what that would look like? Get some thoughts on that? Go ahead and drop that in the chat. Keep community members informed of steps in the process. If we're not paying close enough attention, we can miss the project entirely or miss deadlines. So I'm not certain if that was referring to CEQA specifically or just the overall reg development process.
Can we ask them how they might recommend we inform them of the steps in the process?
Absolutely.
Yeah, drop that in the chat because that would be helpful.
Yeah. And there's one below it. I can't read that one. Let me see if I can see it on the. As was stated before, more permanent monitoring at various locations and major hubs to gain valuable data for everyone to use, study, and talk about, I think that says. Diverse modes of outreach. So that's one I would certainly appreciate some additional thoughts on what you're thinking about when you say diverse modes of outreach. What would be some of those specifics associated with that? Just so we have a better understanding of what you're thinking about. Go ahead and drop that in the chat. And we'll go another just a few seconds. Looks like we got some stability. And if the poll closes and you still got some thoughts, by all means, just go ahead and drop those into the chat. Okay, let's take the next question. Oh, as soon as I said that, one more popped in. Okay, let's give it a few more seconds, Amanda. Include industry and local solutions, community listening sessions on location. Yeah, I would appreciate also here too on in the chat when you say listening sessions on location. What's on your mind when you say location? That'd be very helpful. Okay, let's take a quick look at the next question. So I think that last one said come to community events and I just kind of missed it. So if there's still some additional thoughts there in the previous question, by all means, drop those in the chat. But in this one, what are the best ways we can share information about our regulations and other actions with you? And so email updates, listservs, EJ blog. We have that on our website, CARB website. That refers to our regular program pages, more public meetings, workshops. And then if you don't see your thought expressed there, you can select other and then describe that in the chat for us. And when it comes to like the public meetings and workshops, it'd be good to have a sense on the time of the, what time works best for you, type of venue. Do we still make them virtual or a hybrid type thing where folks can come in person if they choose, but still access virtually if that's more convenient? And on the EJ blog, we do have an EJ blog on our website where we do communicate various goings on with respect to agency activities. Okay, we'll give this one a few more seconds. Looks like we're getting some stability, but more public meetings and workshops by far is leading the way. And so again, if you have some thoughts about like what that looks like, drop that into chat, because that can include standard workshops, listening sessions such as this one, or if you have some additional thoughts about how that should be structured, that'd be helpful to know too. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that.
I think we have one more question, Rich, if that's okay.
Yes.
Okay.
This question, what is the best way for you to participate in upcoming CARB rulemaking activities? And so again, more workshops, increased use of community-centered blogs, more remote participation opportunities, more evening community-centered meetings with CARB staff. So this one may get a little more detail than one of the other questions there. And then if there are other ideas, go ahead and select other, and as usual, describe those in the chat. So I'm seeing a big trend there with evening community-centered meetings with CARB staff. And so an increase of community-centered blogs being tied with more remote participation opportunities. And so there, a question of curiosity I have, is it just more making sure that more of our meetings also have that remote accessibility? Is it that, or do we need to have more sessions like such as this one? So that clarity can also go into the chat.
We do have a couple of other answers in the chat, Rich. I'll go ahead and read those.
Okay, go ahead, yes.
So we have one from Grecia regarding this question. She says, strong, consistent presence and engagement in and with communities, such as resident leaders working with CBOs, etc. During Fresno's TCC process, CGC staff built strong relationships with community, and folks had direct communications with each other, building trust in the process. Rafael Yanes said evening, in-person and virtual options as well. Marvin Norman said both. In-person meetings with remote access is great.
And then I just want to add, I think Ed, you sent that message directly to me, but he reemphasized needing remote meetings.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. All right, so let's go ahead and close that chat, and let's open the floor for discussion. So Gabby, and I think if we don't have any immediate hands raised, we can start with some of the comments and questions from the warehouse section, and we can get answers to those.
Yeah, I don't see any raised hands. We did have a question from Kevin McGay and Eddie Phillips, but those Andre answered in the chat. Not sure if you want to go back to those.
Let's start with any unanswered ones, because I believe we had some questions about like SQL.
We had one, let me go back to it. A comment from Jonathan Pruitt. agree a lot on the question about CARB's plans to collaborate with AG's Good Neighbor guidelines.
Yeah, that's a great comment. This is for everybody who doesn't know. The AG's office released a document kind of summarizing good planning for warehouse projects, setting up warehouse projects, the appropriate analyses to conduct under CEQA for these type of projects. We are in the process of drafting our own draft freight handbook that has been finalized. We have been working with, and that freight handbook would summarize things close to what they've released in their guidelines. We have worked with the AG's office on numerous comment letters. We didn't collaborate with them on the preparation of this AG guidance document, but I'm looking at the guidance document, and it has a lot of the emission reduction measures that we typically recommend in our comment letters. So that's something, yeah, that's something we could definitely look into, is reaching out to AG's office and seeing if we could collaborate with them more on preparing documents and preparing their guidance documents. So.
Thank you, Stan. I'll read another comment we got from Ed Ward. The CEC has estimated that 157,000 electric chargers will be necessary for medium and HD truck use by 2030 to meet the projected demand. What is CARB doing to assure vehicle grid integration is robust enough to support mid to heavy duty EV vehicles?
That sounds like an energy issue, so that's not something we really comment on in our comment letters. I know we passed a lot of regulations. I'm sorry, I'm skipping on the regulations, but I think it was AB. I'm sorry, I forgot the name of the regulation, but it requires like zero emission grid by a certain, I think it was 2045. So we do have regs for infrastructure to try to make the grid a lot more greener. As for the applying energy for those zero emission vehicles that we're pushing hard on, and that's not something we comment in our comment letters.
I think Andre may have something to add on to that.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was just going to add, Stanley was talking about the things that we do and don't include in our comment letters. And Ed, I think as you identified, the Energy Commission has played a big role in doing planning and assessments for what type of infrastructure we need to meet this demand. And alongside them, we work very closely with the other state energy agency, the California Public Utilities Commission, and as I mentioned earlier, the electric utilities themselves. Those energy agencies and the utilities are going to be crucial to actually making this happen. So, you know, CARB has some authority to help influence zero emission vehicle rollout, but definitely we're going to need support from those groups, as well as some of the planning and coordination support that the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development is providing to really make sure that all those charges do get into place and in a timely manner so that the expected rollout from our regulations can be supported by the infrastructure that's needed.
Thanks, Andre. I don't see any raised hands. Do we have any questions from the conference line? All right, I do see Steven Jimenez. I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself.
Thank you, everybody, for allowing me to comment once again on today's presentation here. I really appreciate it. I was wondering if you could just go into depth in regards to the heavy-duty maintenance and inspection program, otherwise known as SP10, the small check for trucks, and just kind of have a quick update on the implementation and whether that could be accelerated. You know, we know that the oldest diesel trucks are the greatest concern, and you know, we just recommend that CARB begin to require the retirement of these oldest trucks on the road.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for your comment. We don't actually have anyone from MSCD that's working on the HDINM program. I don't know if maybe someone from enforcement can answer that. If not, we can definitely follow up with you with the correct contact information and make sure that you get your information that you need.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can just add that if you're interested in the HDI&M program, I would definitely encourage you to join the work groups for HDI&M. They're happening, I think, every other month right now. And there's a mailing list. We can definitely get that information to you.
So while folks are thinking about comments to ask, I wanted to jump back to some of the things that came up during, the warehouse topic that were CEQA related. I recall there was, a couple of comments about, really where our authority is and who is the final decision maker on these projects. And so I wonder if Stan, if you can kind of walk through folks that process and talk about the concept of the lead agency and ultimately how CEQA was enforced.
Oh, yes, definitely. Well, first, before you have CEQA, you have to have a project. Any project that goes through CEQA has to have some kind of tie to the state and local government through like a permit or something like that. So once a project has been established, the lead agency has to determine whether implementation or operation and construction of the project would result in any environmental impacts. And that's typically covered under an initial statement or IS, typically call them. And the lead agency prepares that document. If the IS finds that the project would result in any, significant impacts, the project would have to either, if it's potentially significant avoidable impacts, it would have to prepare a EIR, or if it could be mitigated to less significant level, it could be a mitigated negative declaration. Once either one of those documents are prepared, then it goes out to public for commenting. For an EIR, there would be a notice of preparation that would be released to the public, pretty much some of their project, and asking if there's any comments on the project while they're preparing an environmental impact report. And MND doesn't really have a notice other than releasing to the public and letting the public know the comment period has started. Both of them had their own different review period. The EIRs are 45, and from what I remember, MNDs are about 20 days or 30 days. Once the CEQA document has been released, the public, the lead agency has to take into account everybody's comments, such as our comment letters that we submit on freight projects, and they have to respond to them. And either a final document that goes to the elected body to approve the project under consideration of all the impacts on the project and all the testimonies and so forth. So that's the CEQA process in a quick nutshell. So.
Yeah, thanks, Stan. And I think one point for clarification, when Stan refers to lead agency, those are typically, the cities and counties, in the state that are the final arbiters of those projects. So it's not a function which, CARB, for example, has legal authority, over. And then one of the other, oddities about the whole CEQA process is ultimately it's something that's enforced in the courts.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that's really just a function of the way that part of the state law and the Public Resources Code is written.
All right, we have a question from Eddie Phillips. Given human nature, if the utilities cannot handle the new service connections by 2045, how would that impact the ACF?
So Andre or Craig, I think would be good for this one.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ed. So that's part of the process as we're working with again, the energy agencies and the state utilities to not only figure out kind of a game plan for today, but also contingency plans for any challenges that might come up in the future. So we are building the Advanced Clean Fleet regulation to really take a look at what is possible and how quickly it can roll out. And expect, if you're part of the discussion for this regulatory effort, we will spend additional time really looking at what the impacts of infrastructure mean for the rollout plan. And we have had comments in the past from folks asking that we consider something like an interim review of how infrastructure may play into fleets being able to roll out these technologies. So definitely a good point. And again, stay tuned as part of our regulatory process, because we will be talking about that in more detail.
Thanks, Andre. I have another comment from Andrea. Wondering if my questions about working with statewide planning departments to help inform creating a more sustainable freight system. I think when we silo the sources out, we lose out on the cumulative impacts.
Yeah, I can answer that question from what we do with our CEQA comment letters. We do comment, most of the lead agencies are, city and counties, and they have their own little zoning and their own codes. So when we write our comment letters, we include a list of mitigation measures, or we call them recommended air pollution emission reduction measures. But we hope that the lead agencies see that when they review our comment letters and incorporate them into their planning. We haven't, with our CEQA review process, we do reach out to the lead agency when we have questions about what was about the emission calculations or project design features of a project are. But we haven't, from a CEQA standpoint, we haven't really worked with them with their own local planning. So.
Thanks, Dan. We do have a raised hand from Andrea. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Andrea.
I just wanted to clarify myself. I don't mean the individual planning departments. I do see CARB make those comments, and even to the point of talking to planning departments, and that's much appreciated and I think really helpful and useful. But what I was referring to was, is there a space in government where like the state is looking at the way that the goods movement system is happening statewide? And I don't know if it's Caltrans, I'm not versed in what department that might be, but just wondering, is that conversation happening anywhere on a more statewide regional basis?
So Andrea, yes, definitely. That is an important conversation, and it's an ongoing one that's been going on for many, many years now, and we're actively involved with it. Some of the primary participants in it are the state's transportation agencies, including Caltrans, transportation agency itself, and the Transportation Commission. So a lot of the activities that Caltrans does in the freight sector revolves around putting out documents such as the California Freight Mobility Plan, where they really are taking a holistic look at the entire freight sector for the state, where new freight hubs are popping up, the roadway systems that connect all these facilities, looking at congestion patterns, where the emissions associated with the congestion and these activities are really starting to cause issue for communities. And they bring in pretty much all the relevant state agencies. They also work with local regional planning entities, local governments, and others to come to the table and say, let's all talk about this plan. What can we do better? What type of actions can we commit to? So I'll add a link to that plan in the chat, and you can see a little bit more about the document. It's a very lengthy document, so I would recommend, if you can't read the whole thing, to look at the actions that are listed towards the end, where it really talks about the individual commitments from all the state and local agencies of what they're going to do to make that overall freight system that you referred to work and get better. And as CARB continues to work with Caltrans to refine these plans over the years, we're definitely integrating thoughts about how Caltrans's kind of business as usual repair and maintenance activities, and also their funding programs, can start integrating things like possibly funding zero emission infrastructure through their funding programs, kind of just advancing the freight planning sector to include all these new sustainable measures that we talk about here at CARB. So there are definitely a lot of different activities going on, and I'll forward you that report. But if you do have any follow-up questions on that, please feel to reach out to me, and I'm happy to walk you through the numerous other activities that are going on that front.
Thanks, Andre. I do want to go back to a comment that we got during the warehouse topic regarding the CEQA. A comment from Jonathan Pruitt. The land use part is a huge issue for Lathrop and Manteca.
Oh yeah, I can answer that one. Yeah, when we comment on projects, we're limited to what our expertise is, and that's air quality. So it limits us, and we don't really comment on land use, like city planning and that sort of thing. But we do at times try to dance around it. We try to talk about how zoning and land use change could impact air quality. We have submitted comment letters similar to that in Fresno. I'm skipping on the name because the project is in Fresno, where we submitted a comment letter. Our OCAP team submitted a comment letter on for a project that had a rezoning. So we do comment on those type of projects. I'm not familiar with the project that you're referring to. If you could just shoot me an email about that project, I'd be interested in learning more.
I think when he said Mo Valley, he means Moreno Valley.
Oh yes, Moreno Valley. Yeah, if you have any projects in that area you want us to comment on, yeah, I'd be happy to look at them.
So I would just add, in addition to what Stan covered, kind of our formal CEQA letter process, CARB staff also weigh into some of the larger kind of freight hub projects that are being proposed for the state informally. So two examples of this are Caltrans has been working with stakeholders in the San Francisco Bay Area on a project called the Marine 580 project. This was a project to look at an assessment of opportunities to remove truck traffic from the congested freeways of the region, put container traffic from the Port of Oakland onto barges and ship them to the Central Valley, West Sacramento, and other areas through the waterways, which are further away from communities. And then there's also another project that we're working closely with project proponents on, which is in the San Joaquin Valley. There's an inland distribution hub being considered. And when we work with these project proponents, whether it's Caltrans just doing a research project to look into a possibility, or business interests that are really pushing one of these projects forward, we'll come in from the standpoint of, we want to make sure that they're taking a hard look and proper assessment of the emission impacts of these projects. So we'll provide them with kind of our emissions analysis expertise, make sure that they're up to date on the latest and greatest for upcoming CARB regulations, which will result in cleaner locomotives, cleaner trucks, cleaner commercial harbor craft, and what have you, and make sure that they're really considering all those things when they start talking about the impact to local communities and public health in general. So, we have, Stanley mentioned several different avenues by which we comment on projects. I talked a little bit more about informal things, and then we do participate in those statewide planning efforts, which hopefully trickle down to the local level, and they really consider those documents in their day-to-day processes. But again, like Stanley said, if anybody thinks that there are areas that we could weigh in on that would help out in this area, please let us know. We do have limited resources, but we're happy to help out where we can.
And I think one thing I would add to both what Andre and Stan were talking about, we do have a process that we use to help identify projects and whatnot to comment on. Our span is not infinite; it's actually more on the limited side. But it's absolutely okay to reach out to us if there's a particular project that's impacting your community. For example, a warehouse project or something like that, and ask us to take a look at a look at that. And so we have had community members reach out to us in the past, and we've had reviewed projects based on those recommendations, and a discussion with the folks who are reaching out to us. And so that's another avenue that folks have, rather than necessarily waiting for us or hoping that we would find the same project that you might be interested in. So.
All right, I don't see any raised hands. Do we have questions on the conference line? If not, just wanted to point out that Heather put 2 different links in the chat for the CARB CEQA freight letters and the CARB Community Air Protection Program CEQA letters for your reference.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and ask Kathy to go ahead and share her screen. Catherine, with the notes, so we can make sure that we've captured everything accurately, or if we need to have any additions to that. And again, if there are additions, those should go into the chat. And again, make sure Amanda has your contact information. Here the fonts are nice and big, so I can read them super easily. I like that. So we'll just give Catherine a few minutes to scroll down through that. So if you see something that needs to be clarified, just let us know. Or something to add, let us know. Just drop those into the chat. And so while we're looking at those, one thing I do want to mention, and there's again, all the notes that we captured and comments will be made publicly available. We do look at your comments and suggestions pretty carefully, and they do impact our courses of action and how we look at our programs. They do inform what we're doing with our regulations, and so they're very important, and we very much appreciate having all of those comments. So seeing no additional comments on there, we do have a couple of final polling questions to go through. And so let's get those up, just being a little mindful of our time. I like to respect people's time. All right, first question. What topics are you interested in for future meetings? This is a question we ask after each session, and we do look at those responses carefully, and depending on what that prevailing wind is, it directly influences what the next listening session topic will be. So a couple of there assessing cumulative impacts, more on CEQA, commercial hovercraft, and so we do have a regulation that's being amended that's going to the board for consideration in November of this year. Composite wood, we do have a control measure for composite wood products. Also, some consideration for amendments, probably going to the board a little bit later. Health risk assessment, that's one that's popped up kind of frequently. Pesticides, and then trucks, drayage trucks, fleets, transportation, refrigeration units. And then if there's something on this list which you don't see, you can always put that in the other, and then in the chat, just let us know what that is. And so right now I see trucks as leading. So one thing that'd be useful to see in the chat is if there's something specific about trucks you want to see in a future session, because there's a couple of options there. So it'd be useful to know which one you're pinging on. And then health risk assessment. I guess a tie between health risk assessment and trucks, followed by cumulative impacts. Okay, let's go to the next one. All right, simple question. Would you be interested in attending more meetings like this? And so yes, no. was a third option, unsure. If you answer no or unsure, it would be helpful to us if you would drop that in the chat. Why? If you want to keep that confidential, go ahead and send that directly to Amanda. And that would just kind of help us to plan better and make these meetings more meaningful and helpful to you. So yes, at 100%, I like it. All right, we'll give this one a few more seconds. Okay, and I think we have one more. How can we make these meetings more beneficial? This is another one where you need to type in your response, and so we'll leave this one up for a little bit so folks can get their responses in. And while folks are thinking and typing, I think one thing I'll mention, if there's updates or if you want follow up to anything that was brought up today, please make sure that you send your contact information to Amanda so that we can get the appropriate people in contact with you. And again, we ask that to be sent to Amanda so folks aren't necessarily putting their contact information on the public chat. So I see the first one said host them more often. So it'd be good to get an idea of a frequency you would like to see. That would help us just from a planning perspective. And then I notice in the chat now that I got that working again, regarding trucks as a topic, it'd be great, helpful to have a workshop on the concept paper and how local jurisdictions, community leaders, organizations can support in implementing it. I just wanted to acknowledge that we got that one. Yes, that'll work. Right. Yeah, monthly, quarterly, at least. Yep, that'll work. Have planners in city. Okay, that one went a little too fast for me. Maybe having these quarterly or 3 times a year meetings. Okay, that was in line with the other one. Have planners and city officials in the meeting who are approving these projects to hear comments from the communities most impacted at these meetings. Include business permitting requirements. So just as a question of clarity, is that business permitting requirements from like a city or county in terms of what's needed to get a business operating permit, or is it about a air quality permit from an air district, such as an authority to construct or a permit to operate? So if there's some clarity there, just go ahead and drop that in the chat. Yep, air district, yeah, ATC, PT. Okay, good, yes. Authority to construct, permit to operate. Yes. Okay, we'll go ahead and leave this one up as I just kind of do a couple of, closeout items. And so I'd like to thank everybody for participating today. And again, we take your comments very seriously. We appreciate them having them. We appreciate you spending some time with us today. Once again, if you do want a response to anything that you commented on, make sure Amanda Anderson has your contact information. And we will stay on the line for like a couple of short minutes just in case there's some lingering things. Otherwise, thanks again. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their evening. So thanks, everybody. And Amanda, we could just leave this chat up, this poll up until we close.
Sounds good. And yeah, just to reemphasize what Rich was saying, if you want links to the recordings and any follow-up materials for this, please make sure that you send me your contact information before you leave, and we'll be sure to follow up with you.
Let me go ahead and read this one. Appreciate how interactive these are. If there's a chance or a way to get feedback from non-English speakers or folks who are less technologically savvy, then it kind of trails off there. But I think I get the intent, and that's an interesting comment. So I think we'll talk about that. I'm not certain what the limits of our technology are there, but that's an interesting comment. And by less tech savvy, I assume folks who may not have an easy way to access, Zoom, although you can access it by phone as well too. But if that's what you're thinking about, you just kind of clarify that in the chat if I'm not quite getting that right. All right, thank you very much.